Hey, good morning, everyone. It's our great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Thomas Hylland Eriksen as a last keynote speaker at this conference. Professor Eriksen's book, Small Places, Large Issues, has been the first anthropological work I've read. And I still think it's one of the most brilliant entry points to social and cultural anthropology. And it is, by the way, the anthropological book that I always recommend to anyone that wants to taste our discipline. Thomas Hylland Eriksen is a writer and a professor at the University of Oslo. His fields of research include, among others, nationalism, globalization, Anthropocene, identity politics, and importantly for us here, environmental and climate change. He's conducted fieldwork in several socially and culturally complex societies, from Trinidad, Mauritius to Oslo, and so on. He received numerous awards and honors. He is an honorary doctor of the Stockholm University, of the University in Copenhagen, and at the Charles University, and an honorary member of the Royal Anthropological Institute. The list of his publications and scholarly engagements is way too vast to be listed here, but let me mention just three of them. In 2016, a highly influential monograph titled Overheating, an Anthropology of Accelerated Change was published. In 2019, he co-edited Climate, Capitalism and Communities. And 2 years later, the volume called Cooling Down, Local Responses to Global Climate Change came out. And all those, as well as many others works by Professor Eriksen, had also inspired the anthropological focus of this conference. So, Professor Eriksen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Yes. Well, thank you so much for this far too generous introduction. But you know, since you mentioned small places, large issues, I think I should indulge in some personal reflections on it, because the first English edition came out in 1995. So that's quite a while ago now. And it's been revised and updated a few times. I then realized a couple of years ago that if this book was going to, continue to help people understand the world and the human condition, it would need some more serious renovation. And so in the 5th edition, which is coming out this summer, there's a new chapter obviously on climate anthropology, which was hardly mentioned in the earlier editions. There was a bit on the environment, but the bit on the environment and on nature have been rewritten completely, because so much has happened in the way we see ourselves as part of and not as opposed to or in contrast to what we used to call nature. And perhaps we can still call nature sometimes, but you know what I mean. So that had to be rewritten. And the other sort of big change, well, actually, I added another chapter too, but that's on medical anthropology, so it's not really to the point here. But the other big change is that the digitalization, the smartphone, the computer, the internet now somehow permeates the text because it's everywhere. You go to study the Dayak in Borneo, and you can be online, and you can update your Instagram profile at least once a week when you take the boat to the nearest town. And if you do fieldwork in Queensland, as I did some years ago in Australia, one of the key ways in which I could find people was via the social media. Ask, is there anybody who knows this person? Is there anybody who knows anything about this? And then someone might pipe up and say, yeah, you can ring me up or whatever. So the social media, Facebook, the internet, the smartphone, they're now so ubiquitous that it would seem very strange to write a book about the world and the human condition in 2022, as it was, without including it. So something has changed. When I first started to work in Mauritius, I was interested in the relationship between ethnic identities and national identity, because it's a multi-ethnic society where people are very strong, what they call communal identities, communalistes. They stick to their own and they vote whenever there's an election. The Hindus vote for Hindus, the Creoles vote for a Creole, etc. And so I was interested in how they went about trying to build a shared national identity out of these diverse materials. So I got a lot of pleasure out of reading some of the classic Mauritian novelists and authors, high quality, poetry, novels, etc., emerging from the island in the last century or so. And one of the greatest Mauritian authors was a guy called Malcolm de Chazal. And he wrote in a novel in the 1950s, à l'île Maurice, on cultive la canne à sucre et les préjugés. In Mauritius, we grow sugarcane and prejudice. And it took me many years. I've been working in the island on and off for a few decades. And it took me years to realize that all these years, I had only focused on the second part of that sentence. I'd only studied the prejudices, and I'd almost neglected the sugarcane, although at the height of sugarcane planting in Mauritius, it covered half of the island, half of the surface. 50% of the surface of Mauritius was covered by sugarcane. It's less now owing to infrastructural development and so on, and real estate development, but still. So I try to make amends now. And towards the end of this talk, I'll give you a few snippets, just a few vignettes from my very recent fieldwork in the Indian Ocean. In fact, today's Friday. I returned from Mauritius on Tuesday. So it's very fresh. And I haven't got all the permissions I need yet, so I can only give you a few hints, okay? And the same with the other archipelago a bit further north, the Seychelles, which also provides me with some of the material that I'm going to build this lecture up to, but which will end almost as an afterthought because it hasn't been properly analyzed yet. And as I said, I haven't got all the permissions I need from people, but I've got a few, so I can show you a few things. Now, why diversity? Well, diversity, or rather the threats to diversity somehow grow out of globalization. They're part and parcel of globalization. Globalization on the whole is bad news for diversity. So what do I mean when I say diversity? I don't mean people with different religions living in the same city. That's one kind of diversity, which is interesting in itself. And my friend and colleague Steve Verterek just published a book called Super Diversity, a term that he coined back in 2006 to describe the new forms of diversity in incredibly cosmopolitan cities like London. It's not that kind of diversity. It's a kind of diversity hinted at, ironically, by the late Clifford Geertz, the great anthropologist Clifford Geertz, when he said back in the 1980s, bit sort of tongue-in-cheek and self-ironic, I guess, that, cultural differences will continue to exist. The French will never eat salted butter. But the good old days of widow burning and cannibalism are gone forever. By this, he meant that, for better and worse, there's been a flattening. There's been an erasure of certain forms of diversity. What we sometimes in anthropology have spoken of as radical difference. Incommensurable, not comparable differences. So quite clearly this is happening, and at the same time there is no doubt, and there's great concern and great anxiety around the loss of biodiversity. You see the reports. And I'm not now talking about the IPCC, the climate panel, because it's not really about biodiversity, but the other, the WWF and others who publish reports about the loss of biological diversity. And it's dramatic. We've killed off 68% of all mammals or all vertebrates since 1970. That doesn't mean that 68% of the species have gone extinct, okay? Only that there are, in some cases, very, very few left of each. And the vulnerable, the fragile, and they're threatened by imminent extinction unless we find a way of preventing it. So in my current project, what I'm going to present very briefly here in this lecture is to do with biological and cultural diversity in an era of accelerated, overheated globalization. So I'm looking at anything from infrastructural development, the draining of wetlands, housing estates, agricultural expansion, which is immense. Not least because they need so much grazing land for cattle and so much soya to feed the cattle in northern countries where they can't graze as much as elsewhere. But also language death. McDonaldization, consumerism, Starbucks, the smartphone, and this, oops, and this, which to me is a symbol of the current decade. So I'm looking at all of these, and I'm trying to look at bio and cultural diversity through the same lens by seeing the living world through the lens of what I'm not going to go into the theory here, but let me just mention it. Some of you may have get some ideas from it. Biosemiotics, which is a sort of minority speciality among certain biologists, certain natural scientists, but also philosophers and people from the social sciences and humanities. And the idea of biosemiotics is that we view everything that happens in the living world as acts of communication. Semiotics, interpretation, communication, which means that when a fox chases a rabbit, there is communication between the fox and the rabbit. I mean, there is, obviously. And they respond to each other's actions. And where there's communication, when I play with my dog, if I'd had a dog, I don't have a dog, but if I played with my cat, but cats don't play in the same way as dogs. You see, I think they're a bit, less, well, they're different. So you play with your dog and it pretends to bite you. It says, I'm messing with you. I'm joking. I'm just pretending to be angry because it's pretending to bite you while wagging its tail, right? So it engages in meta communication. So the great cybernetic and ecological thinker Gregory Bateson, one of the great sources of inspiration for current biosemiotics, speaks of this as meta communication. He can communicate that it communicates something. I'm now telling you that I'm joking. Okay, so this is the very briefly the scaffolding of the project. But I'm not delving into the theory. I'm going to give you some stories and details and facts. First, from the tragic act of global flattening, and then perhaps towards the end, something more uplifting about the attempts which are being made, in this case deliberately, to salvage diversity, both in nature and culture. So I'm not distinguishing. Lots of people write about the loss of biodiversity. Quite a few people, especially social linguists and some others, are worried about the loss of cultural diversity, which is much more difficult to measure, by the way. It's much more difficult to gauge, as it were. When is diversity lost? Is it a question that we can even begin to ask? Well, I think we can, but we should be cautious. But I'm seeing both through the same lens and at the same time. Two sides of the same coin. The famous Finnish sociolinguist Tuomas Kutnap-Kangas pointed out just a few years ago that precisely the same areas that have the greatest linguistic diversity also display the greatest biological diversity of species, of ecosystems and so on, in the same areas. So in other words, it's not just something I'm making up. There seems to be a strong empirical connection between different aspects of diversity. So and towards the end, we can discuss what we mean by diversity, because it's not, as I said, it's not an easy word, and so on. Anyway, now I've given you my first slide. And many of us would recall these images from Easter 2021, when an enormous cargo ship, an enormous container ship, got stuck in the Suez Canal, okay, called Ever Given, belonged to the ship owner, shipping company Evergreen. And it was stuck there for some time, and every day it was stuck. The Financial Times and others calculated losses in billions of pounds. Okay, in billions of pounds, not just because of the unloaded or unoffloaded cargo on Ever Given, but also because of all the other ships that were waiting to get through, because quite a bit of the world's trade passes through the Suez Canal. So there were ships waiting in the Red Sea in the south and in the Mediterranean to the north, and they just had to wait for days. And by the way, I mean, some of those Yes, I mean, I'm sure that most of those container ships, they carried stuff like bicycles and electronics and fabrics and so on, but some of them also carried live animals. I would have preferred not to be a live animal on one of those ships at the time. But that's how it was. So this is ever given, and it looks big, and it is big. I mean, look at this. Look at those. Those are pretty sort of grown-up boats. I mean, trying now to pry it loose. And here, look at this excavator. I mean, it looks like a toy. It's a rather large. It's a rather large machine, you know, trying desperately to remove enough sand for the ship to be able to come loose. Eventually, it did come loose, and they're still arguing, I think, about who's going to pay the bill and who's going to pay which bills, because lots of companies lost money. Right, and if you think it's big, if you think it looks really, really big. I mean, how can a container ship be this big? You're absolutely right, because only since the early 2000s, there's been a trebling in the size of container ships. They're 3 times as big now, the largest ones, as they were in 2003. And that's pretty, that's pretty awesome, as we say in contemporary language, isn't it? It's awe-inspiring and frightening. 3 times as big. Now 24,000 TEU. TEU is one of those units, one of those shipping containers, which are standardized, of course, which are the same everywhere. Also an image of global homogenization. Whether it's called Maersk or Hanjin, whether it's from Korea or Denmark, it works exactly in the same way and looks the same and has the same dimensions. And it's adapted to the same cranes, the same ships, the same railway carriages, and the same ports, whether this port is located to Oakland, California, or Dubai, the Emirates. And this is happening while we're sitting here. This evolution, this change. So there's been a 3-fold increase in the average size of the container ship since the early 2000s. And in the same period, this is just a footnote. I just struck this as I spoke about those roughly 15, 20 years. In the same period, there was more than a doubling in the number of plane tickets sold in the world. It doesn't mean that twice as many people travel by plane. The vast majority of the world's population have never traveled by plane. A generation ago, we would have said they'd never made a phone call. We can't say that anymore because they have. But they never traveled by plane. There was more than a doubling from 2 billion tickets in 2004 to 4.5 billion tickets sold in 2019. More than a doubling. Now, in Europe, we would say, and North America, you would say you'd blame it all on the Chinese. The Chinese middle class, they've got so much money and they travel now and they go on holiday and so on. Well, yeah, I guess they do like everybody else, but so do you and I. We also travel more than we did, and there's more and more. There's an overheating going on in the world of plane travel, air travel as well. Of course, we got a temporary respite from this during the pandemic, but it seems to be recovering. It seems to be going back to what they call normal now. Unfortunately, but that's how it is. So only in this century, there's been a dramatic increase in global homogenization, standardization, growth, acceleration, etc., and loss of certain resources that we might find beautiful, meaningful, or even useful in the future. And they may be lost before we even discover them, such as unrecorded languages or undescribed species, right? So this is happening. So well, I've no idea what the Ever Given was. I haven't checked, what actually was in those containers, but I assume that since it was headed from the east to the west, at least one of those containers contained smartphones, possibly more than one, because the smartphone market has completely exploded since 2007. And it's now ubiquitous. It's everywhere. The last figure I saw suggested that the total number of mobile subscriptions in the world, smartphone subscriptions in the world, was more than 6 billion. That doesn't mean that there are more than 6 billion people who have smartphones. Quite a few people have more than one. Elites and so on may have 3 or 4, but still, it's a pretty big number when you consider the fact that back in 2006, the smartphone as we know it didn't yet exist. So this is a typical scene, even in fairly impoverished areas. Areas where people may, they may live in shacks. They have no piped water. They can't afford much by way of electricity. Maybe they have a solar panel. They might have a smartphone or two in the family because they prioritize it, because it's such a high, there's such a high reward for having a smartphone everywhere. I mean, in the poor parts of Kampala, Uganda, you'd find that people who don't have much, they might have a smartphone, and often they would. Now, this is my home screen. Looks diverse, doesn't it? Yeah. I mean, okay, the background image is taken by myself. It's the view from one of the places I've been staying in Seychelles. And then you've got all these little folders with various kinds of apps. But the point is that, yes, there is diversity within the smartphone world, but everything has to be compatible with the smartphone. Otherwise it doesn't exist. You don't exist. I mean, if you're not on the social media, nobody will know who you are. You lose all your friends, they forget about you. The quest for attention, is probably the scarcest resource in human life, the need and the desire for other people's attention, which is becoming a scarce resource. But the opportunities, the affordances, as it were, the possibilities of getting that attention are also growing. But they have to be mediated somehow. And nowadays, increasingly, they're mediated through that little screen. We used to speak in French about le petit écran as the television. I think we now have to speak about maybe le micro-écran as the main sort of source of contact and communication in the world today. So it looks diverse, but when you just, think about it, it's not really that diverse because everything is comparable with everything else, right? It's use value, not exchange. No, it's exchange value, not use value, to use the Marxist terms. And here we have, this is just an image from really from a project that I had a small bit in some years ago on waiting among undocumented refugees. Because the refugees, they flee, but most of the time they don't. Most of the time they wait. And they wait, at several sort of stages, as it were, in their mobility or in the lack of such, they wait. And this man has arrived somewhere. He doesn't know quite where he is, but he's desperate to get the signal so that he can send a message home and tell his parents that all is good and that he's still alive. So that's why he's standing like that. People do this a lot in Norwegian mountains as well, by the way, where coverage is patchy. My wife, she knows exactly which hill to go up to when she needs to update her profile and so on. So it's not alien to us either, but the expectation that coverage should be universal, it should be global, is now really growing. And as we sit here and as I speak, technological developments enabling more surveillance, more connectivity, more visibility, and a more frictionless life are being developed quickly. A life with no friction, with no resistance, but at a cost. Some would say, Dan Podgett, whom we had a chat yesterday, mentioned it as you could even speak of it as a new form of feudalism. But let's not go into that here, because I'm interested in, for the time being, growth and homogenization and the loss of diversity. So look at this. This is the figure of annual sales of smartphones since 2007, since its introduction by Steve Jobs, the first Apple iPhone. And as you can see, there's been a fairly healthy growth. You can't just add these figures together because some of these phones are broken, they're thrown away, etc., thrown in the bin and so on. But still, we continue to buy new phones. The market is never saturated because there will always be a new one with a better screen, with a better camera, with some new affordances, which can translate, easily from Hebrew to Chinese. If you just read it carefully into the text, carefully into the microphone, and so on. So it continues, this frenzy. But it's not just digital, it's not just small things. Everything has to do with trade has grown. And this is why I chose to begin my talk with the image of Ever Given from the Suez Canal, because it's full of all sorts of stuff, all kinds of stuff. There's more of it. And there's been a shift in the balance in the world economy. Again, this is a footnote, okay? Footnote, there's been a shift in the balance in the world economy. So 7 of the 10 largest container ship ports in existence today are in East Asia. Most of them in China. And then there's Busan in Korea and Singapore. None of the European or North American ports make it to the top 10. Dubai is sort of the closest we get to our part of the world. So there's been a clear shift here in where do goods come from? Where is the motor? Where is the engine, as it were, of industrial capitalism? And as you can see, there are a couple of dips in this graph since 1950. There's been a few dips. One was during the financial crisis, 2007, 2008. Second was the pandemic, 2020, 2021. But it's recovered pretty quickly. And if you can see the small numbers at the bottom there, you will see that since the early 1990s, since the beginning of the overheating period, as I think of it, early 1990s, end of the Cold War, deregulation of the Indian economy, end of apartheid, the mobile phone and the internet came into the world. Lots of things happened at the same time, around 1991. There's been a quadrupling, fourfold increase in world trade only since 1990. And there was a bit of world trade in 1990 as well, already. So these things are happening. This growth is taking place very quickly. And I'm often surprised by the fact that so few roving journalists, so few investigative non-fiction writers are looking at this. This frenzied growth, which is just continues to accelerate as we gradually come to realize that the fossil fuel revolution, a little more than 200 years ago, it was somehow a salvation for humanity for a long time. It brought us a better quality of life, better health, more opportunities, better infrastructure, better housing, better food. And that this, which was humanity's salvation for 200 years, is now becoming our damnation. And we need to do something about it very quickly. And that these graphs indicate, they're also indices of the fossil fuel revolution and its effects. Had we ceased using fossil fuels from tomorrow, those graphs would have looked very different. Okay, but I continue to speak about the loss of diversity in some areas. This, I failed to put the legend, but never mind. Can anybody guess what this is? No. It could be the growth of anything, really. No, it's, but this is production of cement. It's cement, which is also an image to me. I mean, there's going to be a chapter about cement and concrete in my book, which is also a symbol of something that used to be quite volatile and flexible and fluid, and which becomes very rigid and hard to manipulate. And just last week, we had a major sort of flooding event in Mauritius. There had been a drought. The drought had gone on for months, and people were worried. Farmers were worried, especially in some parts of the country. It's not a big country, but there are microclimatic variations. So on the west coast, it's drier. So people were really worried. And then the rains finally came, and they came with a vengeance. So there was flooding. I mean, our garden was turned into a lake, and we couldn't leave the house for 24 hours. It was impossible. You know, you wouldn't be able to go anywhere. And one reason that there was water everywhere is that the water had no place to go because of all the infrastructural development. Right? Only a couple of decades ago, it would have been easier because there would have been fewer shopping malls, fewer highways, fewer sort of real estate developments, and fewer car parks, etc. So cement is an interesting place to begin when we think about global homogenization. The great anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, as one might call him in his own language, who died in 2009, in his famous anthropological travel book, Triste Tropique, published in 1955. He writes very dismissively about cement and concrete. So that these Pacific islands, you know, I mean, they've lost all their innocence and their beauty, and they're now just covered by cement, all of them, and so on. Yeah, I mean, there's a romantic and perhaps even reactionary tone in what he says, but even so, you know, with hindsight, you cannot but take this kind of objections to modernity seriously. And so this is the growth in cement production since 1990, more than a fourfold increase in 40 years. Not bad. Much of it in China, much of it dams and that sort of thing, but also, you know, elsewhere. So there was a book by the philosopher Jon Elster, published many years ago, called The Cement of Society, which was about social norms. He had belatedly discovered he was a rationalist, you know, sort of logical philosopher. So he had belatedly discovered the significance of norms. So he wrote a book about norms called The Cement of Society. And I've often thought that someone should now write the book called The Society of Cement, okay, about the current state of things. Now let's move to another area. Many of you will be familiar with this image and how we have done away with so many wild, undomesticated birds. One of the first defining books of the modern environmental movement, Rachel Carlson's The Silent Spring, is exactly about this, the disappearance of birdsong. And one day, I mean, around, you know, late 1950s or so, she discovered that when she was younger, there would always be birdsong in the spring, mating calls and chirping and that sort of thing, and calls for, you know, whatever. And then one year, there was none. There was no bird. There were no birds singing. And this is what inspired her to write the book, The Silent Spring, where the main culprit is DDT, you know, the greatest sort of insecticide, which enabled the fast industrialization of agriculture in places like Florida. Got away with all the mosquitoes and other pests. And but it also got away with, did away with the food that the birds relied on, namely insects. So the birds also died out. So she elegantly, through this example, the silent spring, the disappearance of the birdsong, she connects the phenomenological, her experience, her existential experience with the economy, you know, the petrochemical economy of industrial food production and the loss of biodiversity and options for the future. Because that's what this is all about, isn't it? When we say diversity, we say options for the future, alternatives. Homogenization means that everybody is a tree in an oil palm plantation. Whereas diversity means that everybody is some kind of obscure plant in a rainforest, in a messy, untidy, chaotic rainforest. So 70% are chickens and other poultry, 30% are wild. And most of those chickens belong to just a few breeds. So even within the world, the chicken world, there isn't that much by way of variation, right? I mean, we're talking about 3 breeds, which are basically the most widespread. And of course, this goes for goes for mammals as well. 60% are livestock, mainly cattle and pigs, but also a few others, you know, sheep and so on. 36% are us, you and me. This is biomass, okay? It's not numbers, it's biomass, mammalian biomass, mammals. And 4%, look at that tiny little rhino about to be trampled by the big cow. 4% are wild mammals. And yeah, and this is it's been a dramatic development because this change has happened almost in my lifetime. I was born in 1962, 60 years ago, 61 years ago, and we were then 3 billion. And I don't have the figures, but I would assume that at least half, or maybe more than half, of the wild of the mammals in the world were wild. And I also have memories, just like Rachel Carson, about seeing wild mammals which now have been brought to the brink of extinction, such as rhinos, because we lived in Kenya. We saw rhinos all the time. You had to watch out when you drove your car, especially late in the afternoon, at dusk, so that you didn't collide with a giraffe or a rhino. And now they're all but gone. So, and wetlands are being drained. You know, there's a great concern about wetlands. Those who are concerned with that. Forests are being raised, not just in the Amazon, although that's a place which gets the most attention. I mean, what they're doing in Sweden is also quite serious, actually, with homogenization, standardization of a forest that used to be quite diverse and the source of many various species of both above ground and not least below ground. So we see it, we see this pattern repeating itself everywhere, and therefore, in order to get a full grasp of it, we need to think holistically. We need to think about container ships, smartphones, cattle, and poultry. And this is a cow, and you know the Holstein Friesian race. A Holstein is one race, Friesian is another. Most of the cattle in at least in the UK and in the United States and probably elsewhere as well, but those are the figures I've got, are either Holstein, Friesian, or a crossbreed of both. So it's not just that there's a lot of cattle, but they also mainly belong to the same breed with a little genetic variation, which also signals a loss of flexibility, doesn't it? And I haven't even spoken about pigs yet, which I could. Well, let me say a couple of things about pigs, if there is. I don't have a watch, but just a moment, I have a phone. So yeah, but I'll just have to follow have to check how things are going. Okay, so there's a great anthropological book which should be read by anyone, not least non-anthropologists, because it's a great read and a shocking book. By Alex Blanchette, called Porcopolis, right? And the Porcopolis of the 19th century, for a long time, it was Cincinnati. You know, Cincinnati is one of those cities which has a bright future behind it. It was the city of the future in the 19th century, and then it shifted to Chicago. But he describes a street scene from Porcopolis, from Cincinnati, from the mid-19th century, where all kinds of pigs were sort of wandering about, and they're being herded, you know, by swineherds and owners and helpers and so on. And they were, you know, some were sort of pink, some were black, some were very big, some were not. Some had big tusks, you know, others didn't have much by way of teeth at all. So there was a great variation. Lots of different races, land races of pigs at the time, and but with industrial production, the logic of industrial production dictates that you should do everything as efficiently as possible. So if you have a choice between two breeds of pig, and one of them produces far more bacon much faster than the other, and it's docile, it doesn't mind being locked up, you know, and on the concrete floor throughout his life, which is the case with many pigs. It's docile and passive. You prefer that to the other more lively pig, which may be more tasty, but it doesn't pay off as much. And the thing about the Holstein cow, as his picture also suggests, is that it's the most productive cow in the world regarding milk and milk production. Very, very productive. The other side is the swelling with milk. So what happened in the world of pigs is that if you now went to a big pig farm, as Blanchette did. He did field work in a pig farm in the Midwest, in the American Midwest, where they produce 6 million pigs every year. They produce. It's like a pair of slippers. You know, a pig is like a pair of slippers. There's no dignity to that work. There's no dignity to the life of the pigs, nor to that of the Mexican workers who are working themselves to death, keeping it going. Right. So, so Blanchette describes this, and he says, you know, they're all one breed. It's large white. What we in Norway we call large English, because it originates from Yorkshire, and most of the pigs today, which are bred industrially, not in Melanesian islands. Okay, I'm not talking about these small places or in Malagasy cities, but most of the pigs bred industrially, whether in China or in Denmark or in the US, belong to large white. They belong to the same race. Because just like the Holstein cow, according to the logic of growth, profitability, and capitalism, it's the most profitable and most reasonable, rational, sensible kind of pig to produce. So again, a loss of flexibility, right? Suddenly you're there, you're stuck. This is another interesting development. World capture fisheries and aquaculture production in the country where I live, they've waxed lyrically about farmed salmon as a new oil. Okay, you know, the economic and political establishment were worried about the day when Norway runs out of oil, because Norway is not going to stop exploring for oil, although the General Secretary of the UN tells us to, and everybody else says so, that we should. Norway is not going to do it. There's very little political will. And opinion polls show that about 70% of the Norwegian population think it's a good idea to expand oil fields northwards into the fragile subarctic ecosystems. So don't think about Norway as a beacon of rationality and of ecological responsibility. They're just as selfish as everybody else and short-sighted and nationalist. So but they speak about the aquaculture business, I mean, especially salmon as a new oil, because I could have given you figures, but I won't, because there's too many facts in this talk already, but showing the growth in aquaculture in Norway since the 1970s, when there was hardly any. And it's been exponential. It's been huge. It's been unfathomable. And this year may be the first year in history that more fish is being farmed than fished, right? Than fished, actually. If you see capture fisheries, the amount of fish caught through capture is fairly stable. I mean, since the mid-1990s, it hasn't really grown since the mid-1990s. And this is not caused by a lack of effort. It's not due to lack of effort or technology. On the contrary, there are more trawlers out there. They're more efficient. They've got better echolocation, better GPS, better everything, equipment than before. But there's just less fish. And I asked my brother about this because he's a marine biologist. Is it true? I said, you know, what they say. I mean, I hear these rumors that by 2050, there will be more plastic than fish in the sea. And he says, yeah, but it's not really comparable. I thought he's a researcher, so he can't really say things he has to say things in an oblique way. Yes, but you know, keep in mind that much of this plastic, it just falls to the bottom and gets mixed up with the silt. And so most of this plastic is actually fairly harmless. But there is a problem. He concedes of extinction and of contamination and of destruction of marine ecosystems. So we then move to aquaculture. What's wrong with that? Well, one of the things that's wrong with that is, again, we're losing flexibility. Apart from everything else, we're losing flexibility, because the genetic variation in farmed salmon is much, much less than in wild salmon. So when farmed salmon escape and interbreed with wild salmon, you get an overall reduction in genetic variation. And this is bad news for any species, because a species needs to be flexible, needs to be able to adapt, to adjust. And for that, it needs the toolbox required to adapt to new circumstances, which lies in the DNA. And if the DNA is uniform across the board, you have very little elbow room. One of my favorite examples of this is the East African cheetah. You know, the cheetah, which is an odd or the feline, because it's it's a mix between a cat and a dog in some ways, but it's sort of on the cat side. Okay, so it belongs to the sort of cat family. And the cheetah is diurnal. It hunts during the day, unlike all the other big cats, and it's quite vulnerable to, for that reason, to tourism, for example, because tourists who stop in their sort of vans and to take photos, they disturb them during hunting. But the point about the cheetah is it was probably on the brink of extinction, maybe just 10, 20,000 years ago. And that may not have anything to do with human interference, but just with, I mean, climate change or something else, competition from other species, loss of niches. So the genetic variation within the cheetah species is very narrow. It can only survive in a particular biotope, which is the dry savanna. It can only survive in the dry savanna, whereas a lion or even a leopard have a broader range. They can adapt, you know, to different biotopes and different kinds of forms of ecology. So that's just a way of talking about some of the dangers, some of the sort of real existential dangers, and not just aesthetic or moral, but existential dangers of losing flexibility and losing options. Because we'll be stuck. And that's happening. That will happen with if aquaculture takes over completely. I'm quite convinced, but of course I may stand corrected. Now, to another example, which also shows, it also indicates how bad things can be when they go wrong and how little we learn. It's almost like the Australian, you know, Australians who first they introduced a rabbit so that British settlers could have, you know, go on hunting expeditions for something else than kangaroos, something familiar. But then the rabbits bred like, you know, rabbits, okay? And, and so they brought in foxes to control the rabbit population. And so now, I mean, after a few decades, they realized that we not only have a big rabbit problem, we also have a fox problem in this country. And it continues. So with the banana, there's a similar story, because until the early decades of the 20th century, the dominant breed, the dominant landrace of banana was the Grand Michel. The Grand Michel, which was big, it was nice, it was could easily be transported, and it had many good qualities as a banana. So the Grand Michel spread across the world. Remember globalization. As such, it's not new. It can be traced back to Columbus, to what we call the Columbian exchange. But it's the thing about today is that it's accelerated, and there's more and more and more and faster and faster and faster. So we're losing control. We're out of control. Anyway, the Gros Michel, it thrived for a long time, and then it was attacked by a parasite called Panama worm. And Panama worm threatened, you know, to plunge the world into a chronic banana shortage, because it spread very quickly from Philippines to Venezuela, wherever they grew bananas. Suddenly you had Panama worm. And after the Second World War, the big banana companies like United Fruit and others decided to shift. They burned the fields to kill off this horrible parasite, Panama worm, and instead they planted Cavendish. So what you see here are Cavendish bananas. You see they're also very big and nice, yellow, and look like perfect bananas, the kind of bananas you get in the supermarket in Ljubljana or in Oslo, right? Or in Brisbane or Buenos Aires. It's exactly the same banana. Doesn't really matter. And it's called Cavendish. So problem solved, not really, because the problem of flexibility is still there. And now I hear that there is a new parasite called Panama 4, which is spreading among Cavendish and threatening to wreak havoc, just as it did with Gros Michel. Had they instead had 10 or 20 or 30 different breeds of banana, this would have been avoided. So that's just one very simple example of the dangers of not taking flexibility and options into the equation when you begin to calculate future profits, because that's what they do in capitalist enterprises. Another example, I could go on for a little bit longer. That's great. Yeah. So I'll finish pretty soon, actually. But I have to give you some stories about more of a more uplifting kind at the end. These are avocados. 85% of the avocados grown in the world. Now, it sounds as if I'm repeating myself, am I? I mean, first of all, cattle, pigs, chickens, bananas, and now the avocado. Well, 85% are Hass avocados. And Rudolf Hass is an interesting story about Rudolf Hass, because he was a German immigrant to California. He was a postman, but also an amateur horticulturalist, had a big garden. And he was pottering about in his garden whenever he had a day off. And he came up with, through coincidence probably, through trial and error, the Hass avocado, the Rudolf Hass avocado, which was perfect. The shape, the skin, the texture, the taste. The stone was not too big, and so on and so forth. So it spread epidemically, and 100 years later, less than 100 years later, 85% of the avocado sold are Hass. So that's also, I mean, it tells you something about speed, doesn't it? And about profitability, and about about capitalism, and the way in which capitalism drives homogenization and turns us into turns everything into Starbucks and all of us into trees in the plantation. Now, towards the end, some more uplifting stories. So this is the Seychelles, or these are the Seychelles. Only 3 of the islands are basically inhabited. There are a few people living in some of the others. And there are some more remote coral islands, which are not shown on the map. But you see where it is, north of Madagascar, east of Tanzania, just south of the equator. And this, Pralin, La Digue, but most people live in Mahé, which is the big island at the bottom, Mahé, where the capital Victoria is located. And where there was an interesting project that started during the pandemic and which is continuing now, and which I am following up. And this is one reason I went to the Seychelles in December, called the Creole Garden, where there is a conscious attempt to recover lost knowledge about plants, both medicinal plants, beautiful plants, endemic plants, useful plants, edible plants. Keep in mind that in the history of humanity, we've eaten something like 7,000 different species of plants. And now we get 75% of our calories from just 4. Okay? So there's been a narrowing. And in Seychelles, they can be quite creative. They eat stuff that you wouldn't think of as edible, and they can make it taste good. And so the Creole Garden project, it was both bio and cultural. That's one of the things that interested me, both bio and cultural. Recovery. And the third thing that interested me, I mean, one thing bio, second thing cultural, third thing is that there was no quest for purity. They were not yearning for roots and authenticity, as one often is, and which frequently leaves you with a bitter aftertaste, because there is something uncomfortable about the way people sometimes in Australia speak of cane toads in the same way as other people may speak of Muslims. Invasive. They don't belong here. They're never going to integrate. They're never going to, etc. So this is not an issue in Seychelles, which was at the crossroads, which was quite poor ecologically when Europeans arrived in the late 18th century, because it's an isolated archipelago in the Indian Ocean. So many of the plants and much of the knowledge which is being recovered are not as it were, endemic. They cannot be traced back, to Seychellois roots, but they belong because they were used by slaves, who were sometimes allowed to have a little plot of land, and they were grown, also by freemen and their familiar. And there are stories about them. And some of these plants, they also turn up in folk tales and myths. So this is La Casa Mama, this is Mama's house, one of the key persons in this Creole garden project. She's an elderly woman who has this big, unwieldy, it looks chaotic when you arrive, but it really is quite tidy actually, garden, where she grows hundreds of different species. Now this is her assistant at the front, and the one at the back is actually my friend from the university of Seychelles, because even though it only has 90,000 inhabitants, Seychelles has a university. where they do cultural studies and they have a real concern with diversity. Okay, so we're making a tour of this, let's say, unwieldy, chaotic, complex garden. And this is Mama herself explaining what these hanging flowers, how they can be used for medicinal purposes and healing purposes. I'm not taking a position here on whether these herbal medicines work or not, only that this is part of their biocultural heritage and part of their biocultural identity. And when everything stopped during the pandemic, everybody was sent home. Keep in mind, Seychelles, 95,000 people. The economy has two elements formally. The third informal element is whitewashing of foreign money. Because, I mean, otherwise it would have been inexplicable where all that money came from. Anyway, two official parts of the economy. There's a bit of tuna canning and so on, tuna fishing, and there's a lot of tourism. So from one day to the next, March 2020, the country was brought to a halt. And so many people went home, and some of them started, to recover some of this knowledge. Suddenly they had a lot of time on their hands. It's not a place where people starve. They had something to eat, but they had little to do. So it almost became a mass movement, the Career Garden, and we're now hoping for it to continue post-pandemic as a way of recuperating and recovering and nurturing biocultural diversity. So she's now taking us around explaining what all of these plants are, and she also does handicrafts. And look at that. I mean, that doesn't look very Indian Ocean, does it? That little sort of tablecloth. Some of this is Belgian inspired, some of it French. Doesn't really matter to her. It's the kind of thing that she learned how to make when she was a girl, and she now wants to teach to younger women. It's become part. That's part of the Creole miracle, isn't it? The ability, the Creole society's ability to absorb influences, impulses, and learn from other societies without losing themselves. You can learn from Belgians without becoming a Belgian. You can perfectly well make that tablecloth without ceasing to be a Seychellois. You just have to do it in a Seychellois way. So she has lots of this beautiful stuff. These mats also, woven mats, which are more, I guess, grow more out of the local flora because they're made of banana leaves. But similar mats can also be found, in the Pacific and elsewhere. That doesn't really matter. The point is that this is local knowledge. It's only here. And it's largely non-scalable because it has to be undertaken by people who have the skills. It can't be done in a factory. Okay, so that was a little bit about the Career Garden, and this is supposed to be a film. Let's see if it works. Yeah, it actually works. So you can just have a brief look at the.
Ali, okay.
Ali. Oh, much shorter than I thought. Anyway, you saw Mama and the water tank in the background. So, and I now very quickly speak of a different project that I'm also looking closely into in Mauritius. And now you see where Mauritius is. It's a bit further south. It's more east of Madagascar, just inside the tropics. So they have something they call a winter. When people complain about the cold. In the highlands, in Tilpip, in the middle of the island, where it gets so cold, it's unbelievable. And I was, how cold? Well, 15 degrees in the night. And as a North European, I say, shut your gob. I mean, I don't want to listen to this. Anyway, so this is Mauritius, which is a much larger and more complex place in many ways than Seychelles. 1.2 million people. So it's more than 10 times the size. So when you travel to Mauritius, you may think that it's small, but if you travel to Mauritius from Seychelles, as I did just before Christmas, you feel that you've arrived, at the sort of big, bustling metropolitan place. So always relative. Now, Mauritius there's also great concern. And it's a fairly widespread concern. It's not just elite middle-class people. Quite a few people have a concern with preserving what they have and what they're about to lose because they've seen the mollification, the highwayification, the shift from home-built, brick houses or even simpler houses to standardized, dwellings built by big international engineering companies, which looks basically the same as they would in South Africa. So there is a concern, there is a feeling of loss. Kentucky Fried Chicken, which had 3 outlets when I started to work in Mauritius in 1986, they now have 27 and growing. 27 outlets for a population of 1 million, but they like fried chicken. So that's one example. They're not doing too badly in all domains. I may be exaggerating a bit, but there is a clear trend towards homogenization and standardization. So in the project I'm looking at in Mauritius is called La Case Flamboyant. Here we are, La Case Flamboyant, which means the house of the flame tree. You can see the flame tree hovering, and there is in fact a real existing flame tree which was in flower when I last visited at the end of last month. And La Case Flamboyant is, curiously enough, it's built on the land of a sugar estate called Medin, because they no longer need a factory because of the centralization. All the sugar is now being refined in just 2 or 3 places in the island, right? Scaling up, okay? So it was lent to a couple of friends of mine, Malen and Adi, who refashioned it into a kind of biocultural diversity haven. So here you see this is just an image of a small bit of it. Amateur art, professional art, improvised art, plus very many different kinds of plant that they're growing there. And they're sowing these days. I just saw La Case Flamboyant on Facebook this morning, and they're now sowing new flamboyant trees. And for that, you need patience. If you're going to sow a tree, you need to wait for at least 20 years, before it gets big. So, and they have exhibitions, outdoor, indoor exhibitions. They have talks sometimes. People like yours truly. I mean, I went there and gave a talk, in January, and others, and other events. Now, this is Malen, who's inspecting some of his treasures. And he knows what everything is. You can point, what's that, Malen? And what's it used for? Well, this is a such and such, and it can be used against cold. So this is really good as a spice, if you're making a curry poulet, if you're making a chicken curry, and so on. Spices and plants which are not, even today, not that well known, but which were better known a couple of generations ago, before Kentucky Fried Chicken. So that's the idea. And here he is again in front of the ovens. This was the day of my talk at the La Case. As you can see, it's still very dry. The rains came about a week later. And in front of his movie, these are the native mangoes. My son claims, he lives in Zurich, that the mangoes you get in Zurich are much better than these. And I said, yeah, I'm sure you're right, just don't tell Malen, okay? So the point here is not about purity, it's about diversity, and it's about salvaging both knowledge, skills, identity, and flexibility, both in terms of cultural knowledge and skills and biodiversity. So I wrap up. I've already spoken a bit longer than I had expected, but that always happens. So diversity, yes. I mean, this is just by way of concluding. And you may already know what I was going to say. If we're going to salvage, if we're going to save diversity, and really if we're going to be able to deal with the mounting challenges facing humanity, where we're digging our own grave. I mean, we're painting ourselves into a corner, and it has been clear for a very long time. And nobody except idiots seem to deny it. Everybody knows, but nobody is doing anything much. And why is that? It is to do, too much of it has to do with scale. So if you can scale things down sufficiently, that makes them invincible to interference from the state and from big corporations. And this is why the linguists Kangas could say that the areas which have display the greatest linguistic diversity also seem to have the greatest biological diversity. This is precisely because these would be areas which are uninteresting to the state or inaccessible to the state and uninteresting for investors. So if you can just do things at a small scale based on local knowledge, embodied knowledge, the kind of knowledge you've got in your hands, like Mama in Mama's garden in Seychelles, then that is an inoculation against being appropriated. Until quite recently, Yanomami children, Yanomami is one of the largest, it's the largest, in fact, indigenous group in the Amazon, straddling the boundary, the border between Venezuela and Brazil. Until quite recently, a Yanomami child would know the name of more than 60 species of fish that were living in the streams near them, right? Which is pretty impressive, isn't it? But they were all, and they knew, you know, they would learn, you know, what the uses were. Could they be fried? Could they be eaten? Were they dangerous, etc.? Were they poisonous? Who were their enemies? They've been observing those fish. That's local knowledge. Doesn't travel. It only works there because that's where the rivers are. And if you confront a 17-year-old in Slovenia or Norway where they're saying, so how many species of fish do you know? Oh, maybe, you know, salmon, cod, mackerel, and then maybe 2 or 3 more. But they might then object that, well, but we know a lot of other things. We know the distance between the Earth and the Moon. We know the name of the capital of Nepal, okay? And so on. And we know, we've learned about the causes of global climate change and the Second World War. Yes, but that's decontextualized knowledge. That's universal knowledge. It's decontextualized. So it's a different order. It's knowledge of a different order, and it's standardized. It's a kind of knowledge you can easily access on your smartphone. Knowledge about those species of fish you can only access by going there. That's what we mean by when we, in anthropology, we speak of local knowledge. You can only understand and learn by actually being there. So scaling down, slowing down, and cooling down. And here we are, yes, I've already mentioned the non-scalable. And I think in the spirit of this conference, that really, I may have bracketed the economic bit because that's a different lecture, but it's important in its own right. But I think I've spoken about both the social, cultural, environmental, and existential dimensions of sustainability. I want to be a sustainable person. I don't just want to live in a sustainable society if it cannot enable me to be a sustainable person who feels at home in my own skin and so on. So that was it. And on this note, I wrap up and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this inspiring lecture. I'm sure there are already some comments or questions for Professor Eriksen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting and thought-provoking lecture presentation. I was just, you know, you get so many thoughts out of this, and I was reflecting upon the importance of genetical diversity, as you mentioned, within species diversity. And I know some colleagues who knows more about biology than I told me about a specific species of ants. And, you know, they go out foraging, trying to find food in different directions. And then 1 or 2 are successful and they make a trail and everyone goes there. No, not everyone goes. Like 80% of this species go to that fantastic place. And the rest of 20%, they continue just to be sure that if that runs out, you have something else to do, some other food to find, hopefully. And then I was just, you know, reflecting widely and towards politics. And I was thinking what your thoughts are on the development in countries like Sweden and Norway, for example, and Europe and some other countries, where we seem to think that we should have less diversity, in-group diversity. And by that, I mean that we kind of course, the populist parties that are totalitarian, they want everything to go in the same direction, and to simplify at least. But also when we talk about, Agenda 2030 and the sustainability goals and sustainability more broadly, sometimes I get the impression that we should bring everyone along, everyone same direction. And that sounds a little bit dangerous, or what's your thought on that?
Thank you. Yes, it's a great question. Yes, in practice, of course, we choose less diversity also in agriculture, but that's for reasons of profitability. Now, what you're talking about is a state logic. And I don't think, I'm not one of those who blames everything on capitalism and neoliberalism. I think we should look carefully at what the state has done over the years as well, in order to promote homogeneity, to force people into place. I mean, look at the Chinese state and the Uyghur. There's a great book by the political scientist and anthropologist James Scott called Seeing Like a State, which in our world, in anthropology world, everybody has sort of, at least is familiar with. If they haven't read it personally, as I say, they're familiar with it, which is about standardization, making people behave in a particular way because it's so much easier to govern, and making your populations legible, as he says, making them legible, easy to read for statistics, easy to classify. And if they're all over the place, if you have a large group of Roma gypsies or transhuman Sami who don't have a fixed place of abode, where can you send the tax return? Where should their children go to school? How can you be sure that they respect national borders? I mean, they do everything wrong. So that shows that, in fact, there's a fairly limited tolerance for diversity in our kind of society. And it is assumed that we have found the best solution for everyone. And this goes back much further than populism. You can look at the history of social democracy in our countries, and you'll find that they really believe that they knew what was best for everyone in many ways. So one of the things that I think we can learn from places like Mauritius, and I say this whenever I'm there, that you should try to market this to the rest of the world. Lots of things are wrong in Mauritius. They have a terrible government at the moment, horrible government, which doesn't really represent the population. It just represents the Hindus, and not even all the Hindus, just a Vaish caste. So they're horrible, and there's far too much corruption, and there are drug crimes, and there's whitewashing of money, and there are sort of South African investors who come in and buy up lots of land without really moving there, and so on. But they have things to be proud of, such as living with difference. That difference is not something to worry about. Certain kinds of difference, yes. I don't think we want to return to widow burning and cannibalism. So you need some common denominators. Some forms of homogenization are good. Human rights. I think human rights were a terrific idea, but it came from here and it spread worldwide, and it was a great idea, and it's been very helpful for lots of struggling groups everywhere in the world. But it's eradicated some diversity, right? Because it says that all humans have dignity, all humans are equipped with inborn rights, and that's a very sort of radical thing to say to a tribal person from East Africa. So, yes, I think that would be the sort of the shortest answer, is that we should learn from societies where they've been able to live with diversity and benefit from it and profit from it. The great sociologist Durkheim, more than 100 years ago, in his book on the division of labor and society, distinguished between what he called mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. Mechanical solidarity is something that you get when people do the same thing. You till the soil in the same way, you wear the same hat, you eat at the same time as your neighbor, and therefore you feel safe and secure with your neighbor. Strong sense of solidarity. Whereas organic solidarity is the opposite. Organic solidarity is what you get when you have a complex division of labor. I'm so grateful that there are plumbers and electricians who can help me out when I have difficulties in my house. There's not much I can give them in return. I could lecture them, of course, about ethnicity, but I can pay them money. So that's the second thing. So that's organic solidarity. And maybe we could think a bit more widely about organic solidarity, complementarity, that in fact, the fact that people have different skills. Not everybody needs to take a master's degree in order to feel successful. There's a great pressure in our part of the world now for people to take higher education. And also for people who really shouldn't. They should do other things. They should do things for their hands. Things they're good at. That makes them feel recognized and respected. People who, you know what I mean? So I think that would be, there's something to be done there. And I don't see any of our major political parties. Maybe the Green Party could be persuaded to pursue that path, but I don't see any of the major political parties we have thinking along those lines at all.
Thank you very much for this talk, and especially for these uplifting stories at the end. That's what I really needed, actually, after these 3 years of these three days of the conference. And I was thinking of this issue of scale. I think it's really, really important, because you mentioned with these uplifting stories that they are not unscalable, and there are thousands and millions of projects like that all over the world, also in Slovenia, all over the world. So how do they fit in this general global scale by being unscalable? Because if they become scalable and put on the global level, then they become part of the problem, actually, not part of the solution. So what's your comment on this relationship?
Obviously, I can't give you a full answer. I mean, I'm also running out of time, but it's a great question. So if they were to be standardized, as you've got a sort of standardized diversity project, biodiversity project, I don't think it's going to happen. There is a big organization run by the anthropologist Lisa Murphy on biocultural diversity, where they've scoured the world and they've found dozens of similar projects trying to salvage diversity, but most of them are indigenous groups. And that's fine, it's important, but it's low-hanging fruit. I'm more interested in you and me. What can we do? And this is why I'm interested in Mama in Mauritius and Malen, who used to work for a big hotel corporation until he retired. But he's always had that sort of social engagement, so it's not something new for him. What we can do. No, I think scaling sideways is one way of thinking about it. We can scale things down, but then you become impotent, because then it's only here and the rest of the world changes. And you become like that little red sort of house surrounded by skyscrapers, and you've lost. You realize that it's the end, or you scale up, and then you become Starbucks, or the Starbucks equivalent, standardized. You have to do things this way. That was one of the problems with fair trade in many parts of the world, that people had to comply with so many rules and regulations that they gave up. They couldn't become fair trade. So they started in Dominica, in the Caribbean, they started to sell marijuana instead. It was so much easier to sell marijuana than fair trade bananas. But they would have preferred fair trade bananas had it been practically possible. So I think scaling sideways through networks. And that's one of the affordances that this technology gives us. Gives us the possibility to collaborate without having to form pyramids or hierarchical organizations or centralized organizations with offices in Geneva and New York. So maybe that could be part of the future. And this may be less utopian than it sounds. And you also said, well, there are thousands of similar projects. There's a great concern with loss and with recovery. And they think along many of the same lines. And there's no simple solution. I mean, survival requires diversity. Diverse solutions, locally tailored, specific solutions. I would say that I wouldn't as an anthropologist, because our field of study is, after all, human diversity. So.
Thank you so much again. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but we can continue this discussion during the coffee break. So thank you again for your lecture.